The early morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gold Coast penthouse, casting golden hues across the polished marble floors. Edward Martin sat at the kitchen counter, his tablet glowing with the latest market reports. To anyone looking in, this moment could have been a snapshot of perfection, a successful CEO enjoying his quiet, sophisticated life. Yet, Edward felt the growing weight of an invisible fracture. Vanessa, his wife of 12 years, breezed through the living room. Her athletic figure was clad in sleek workout gear, her long hair tied back in a ponytail. She barely glanced at Edward as she gathered her bag and keys. "Heading to the gym," she said, her voice distant, almost mechanical. The sound of the door closing echoed longer than usual, leaving a heavy silence behind. Edward's eyes lingered on the door, his thoughts momentarily detached from his meticulously scheduled day. Something about Vanessa's tone unsettled him. Was it the brevity of her words? The way she avoided his gaze? Shaking the thought away, Edward returned to his tablet, dismissing his unease as a byproduct of his high-pressure lifestyle. Later that evening, they sat across from each other at the dining table. The meal, prepared by their private chef, was as exquisite as ever, but the atmosphere was far from it. Vanessa scrolled through her phone, her thumb swiping lazily while Edward spoke about his upcoming investor meeting. "You're not listening, are you?" he finally asked, his tone sharper than intended. Vanessa looked up briefly, her expression unreadable. "I heard you," she replied simply, but the edge in her voice made it clear she resented the question. The tension in the air thickened, unspoken words circling like vultures. Edward set his fork down, the clatter reverberating. "If there's something on your mind, Vanessa, just say it." Instead of answering, Vanessa pushed back her chair and stood, her movements fluid but detached. "I'm tired, Edward. I'm going to bed." With that, she disappeared down the hall, leaving Edward alone with the echo of her retreating footsteps. As the night deepened, Edward remained in the dining room, his mind racing through fragmented thoughts. He scrolled through his own phone aimlessly, but his focus snapped into place when a message appeared on the screen. It was from an unknown number. The text was chilling in its simplicity. "Do you really know what your wife is up to?" Edward's stomach twisted as he reread the message. A wave of doubt crashed over him, flooding his mind with possibilities he didn't want to consider. Vanessa had been distant, but this? Was it paranoia, or was someone deliberately planting seeds of mistrust? He locked his phone and stood, pacing the room as the city lights twinkled through the windows. The perfect image of his life seemed to ripple, threatening to shatter entirely. By the time he joined Vanessa in bed, she was already asleep, or pretending to be. Edward lay awake, the message replaying in his mind like a haunting melody. It was a question he couldn't shake, no matter how desperately he wanted to. What if the perfect life they had built was nothing more than an illusion? Edward sat in his office the next morning, staring blankly at his computer screen. His assistant had just left after handing him the latest reports, but his mind was miles away. The message from the previous night still lingered in his thoughts. He had locked it away in the recesses of his mind when he woke up, hoping it was just a prank. But something about the timing, Vanessa's recent aloofness, and the message's pointedness made it impossible to ignore. He pulled out his phone and read the message again. "Do you really know what your wife is up to?" The words stung like a splinter. Without thinking, he opened Vanessa's recent credit card statements, a habit he hadn't practiced in years. His breath caught when he noticed multiple charges for a boutique hotel downtown and lavish dinners at upscale restaurants he'd never visited. A knot tightened in his stomach. Who was she meeting? The following evening, Edward tried to approach Vanessa with casual conversation during dinner. "I noticed some recent charges. Fancy places. You've been treating yourself?" he asked, keeping his tone light but probing. Vanessa barely looked up from her plate. "Oh, just catching up with friends," she said, her voice detached. The response wasn't unusual, but it felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. His heart sank. Was she lying? As days passed, Edward's unease grew. Vanessa's gym visits seemed longer, her demeanor more guarded. The air between them had shifted. One evening, as she left for another gym session, Edward found himself pacing their living room. His gaze landed on the envelope he'd hidden in a drawer. her latest credit card statement. He retrieved it, his hands trembling slightly. The charges painted a picture he couldn't ignore. Consistent, expensive, and inexplicable. By the end of the week, Edward made a decision. He contacted Robert Callahan, a private investigator he'd met years ago during a corporate merger. Callahan was discreet, thorough, and, most importantly, loyal to the paycheck. "I need answers, Robert," Edward said over the phone, his voice tinged with urgency. "Follow her. I need to know what she's doing and who she's with." Callahan didn't hesitate. "I'll start tonight," he replied, his tone steady and professional. That night, Edward sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The TV played softly in the background, but he wasn't watching. Instead, his thoughts spiraled. He remembered their early days, their laughter, their shared dreams. How had it come to this? Had he missed the signs, or had Vanessa drifted away despite his best efforts? As the hours passed, his phone buzzed with updates from Callahan. The investigator's texts were brief and factual. She left the gym, meeting someone at a cafe on 12th Street. 30 minutes later. "It's a man. They seem close." Edward felt his pulse quicken. His worst fears were taking shape. But he needed more than cryptic messages to confront Vanessa. He needed undeniable proof. Around midnight, Callahan sent a final update. "She's at the Regal, Suite 504. They've been there for an hour. Do you want me to continue?" Edward stared at the message, his hands clammy. The name of the boutique hotel burned into his mind. The same one on the credit card statements. "No need," Edward typed back, his thumb hovering over the send button. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed it. As he sat there, gripping the phone tightly, a new thought began to form. Was this just a betrayal of the heart, or was there something more sinister behind Vanessa's actions? The message he'd received didn't just point to infidelity, it carried a deeper implication. Edward didn't know whether he was ready to uncover what lay beneath the surface. Edward stared at the manila folder on his desk, its edges worn from where he had gripped it too tightly. Callahan's name was scrawled on the top, but it was the weight of its contents that felt suffocating. Inside lay the truth, or at least enough of it to shatter the image Edward had clung to for years. Taking a deep breath, he opened the folder. The first few photographs were harmless enough. Vanessa leaving the gym, sipping coffee at a cafe. But as he flipped through, the images became undeniable. There she was, laughing with a man at a dimly lit restaurant. The next photo showed the two of them entering the lobby of the Regal, arms brushing in a way that suggested more than casual acquaintance. Edward's hand shook as he turned the page to find a grainy shot of Vanessa and the man, later identified as Liam Carter, exiting the hotel. She looked radiant, her face glowing with an ease Edward hadn't seen in years. His chest tightened, anger and heartbreak warring for dominance. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a mockery of everything he thought they had built together. The final item in the folder was a report, meticulous in its detail. Callahan had documented Vanessa's movements with precision, listing times, locations, and even snippets of overheard conversation. One line stood out, underlined in red. Mentioned needing to end this soon. Edward's brow furrowed as he read it again. What was Vanessa planning to end? The affair? Their marriage? Something else entirely? The next morning, Edward confronted Callahan in his office. "You said there's more," Edward began, his voice tight with controlled rage. "What else do you know?" Callahan hesitated before sliding another envelope across the desk. "Vanessa has been making calls to an unregistered number," he said. "It's frequent, almost daily. I traced it back to a burner phone. Could be nothing, but it's unusual." Edward's mind raced. The affair was bad enough, but now there was this, another layer of deception. Was Vanessa being blackmailed? Or was she orchestrating something more sinister? Later that evening, Edward sat across from Vanessa at their dining table. He had planned to confront her, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he studied her closely. She was radiant, as always, but there was something different, an edge of nervousness she couldn't quite hide. "Busy day?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Same as usual," Vanessa replied, offering a tight smile. "And yours?" Edward's knuckles whitened as he gripped his glass. "Eventful," he said, his tone laced with meaning. For a brief moment, Vanessa's eyes flickered with what Edward could only interpret as fear, but she recovered quickly, returning her gaze to her plate. That night, Edward paced the penthouse, the city lights casting fractured reflections on the glass walls. He thumbed through Callahan's report again, each line cutting deeper than the last. One particular note stuck out like a beacon. Carter mentioned an ultimatum. Edward froze. What ultimatum? And why hadn't Vanessa mentioned anything to him? The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was a web of secrets and lies that Vanessa had carefully constructed. But for what purpose? Edward didn't have the answers, but he was determined to find out, and when he did, there would be no turning back. Edward waited in the living room, the folder from Callahan resting on the coffee table like a ticking time bomb. The photographs, the report, every shred of evidence felt like a weapon in his arsenal, but one he wasn't sure how to wield. The clock struck 8 as the front door opened and Vanessa walked in carrying a gym bag. She glanced at Edward, her expression briefly flickering with curiosity before settling into her usual calm demeanor. "You're home early," she said, hanging her bag on the hook. Her voice was light, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Nervousness? Annoyance? Edward didn't reply immediately. Instead, he motioned to the seat across from him. "Sit," he said, his voice firm but controlled. Vanessa hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly before crossing the room and sitting down. She crossed her legs, leaning back in a posture of practiced ease, but her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her watch. "What's this about?" she asked, her tone laced with irritation. Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "This," he said, picking up the folder and tossing it onto the table in front of her. Vanessa's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to Edward. Her expression hardened. "What is this, Edward?" she asked, her voice sharp now. "Open it," he demanded. His heart pounded, but his voice remained steady. Vanessa hesitated, then reached for the folder. As she flipped through the contents, her face remained unreadable. When she reached the photograph of herself and Liam entering the Regal, she closed the folder with a sharp snap and looked up at Edward. "So you've been spying on me," she said, her tone cold. "That's a new low, even for you." Edward's temper flared. "A new low? Don't turn this on me, Vanessa. What is this? Who is he?" Vanessa leaned back, crossing her arms. "His name is Liam Carter. He's my trainer, Edward. And yes, we're involved. Is that what you wanted to hear?" The words hit Edward like a physical blow. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. "Why would you do this?" Vanessa exhaled sharply, her frustration evident. "Because you stopped seeing me, Edward. You're so consumed by your work, your image, your empire, you forgot about us. I needed something, someone." Edward stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I gave you everything," he shouted. "A life most people could only dream of, and this is how you repay me?" Vanessa's eyes followed him, her own anger flaring. "Everything? You think money and a penthouse make up for the years I've spent feeling invisible? Feeling like a piece of furniture in your perfect little world?" The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of their words hanging between them. Edward stopped pacing and turned to face her. "End it," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Whatever this is with him, it ends now." Vanessa shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "No," she said simply, "I'm not ending it." Edward stared at her, stunned. "You're choosing him over me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm choosing me, Edward," Vanessa replied, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "For once in my life, I'm choosing what makes me happy." Edward felt the ground shift beneath him. The woman sitting across from him wasn't the Vanessa he thought he knew. She was someone else entirely, someone who had grown tired of being a supporting character in his story. Vanessa stood, picking up the folder and holding it out to him. "I'll save you the trouble of spying on me again," she said. "You've got your answers. Now figure out what you're going to do with them." She turned and walked down the hall, leaving Edward alone in the cavernous room. The sound of her bedroom door closing echoed like the final punctuation on their argument. Edward sank into the chair, his hands trembling as they gripped the armrests. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The silence in the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the city below. Edward sat in his study, staring at the drawer he had avoided opening for years. Vanessa's words from their argument earlier replayed in his mind. "You forgot about us." But what stung more was her defiance, her refusal to end the affair. She had chosen herself, as she put it, and Edward, for all his power and control, was left feeling powerless. His hand trembled as he reached for the drawer, pulling it open. Inside lay a faded leather journal, its corners worn from years of handling. It wasn't his journal, it was Vanessa's. She had left it there, intentionally or not, and tonight Edward felt compelled to read it. Flipping through the pages, Edward saw entries that spanned years when their marriage seemed solid. The earlier pages were filled with moments of happiness, their travels, her thoughts about their future, and her pride in his accomplishments. But as the entries progressed, the tone shifted. Edward is always at work. Even when he's here, his mind is elsewhere. I try to tell him how I feel, but he doesn't listen. He nods, smiles, and goes back to his emails. Edward felt a pang of guilt. Had he been blind all these years? He turned to an entry dated 5 years ago, and his stomach dropped at the words written in Vanessa's familiar cursive. "I found out about her today. The assistant. He thinks I don't know, but I do. I stayed silent because confronting him wouldn't change anything. He's not the man I married anymore." The assistant. Edward's mind flashed to a brief, ill-advised affair he had buried in the past. It had been a moment of weakness during a turbulent time at work. He had convinced himself Vanessa would never find out. Yet here it was, in her own words, a wound he hadn't realized he'd inflicted. Another entry read, "I thought about leaving, but what would I be without him? Edward is everything to me and nothing all at once." The words struck Edward like a blow. He closed the journal, his breaths shallow. Vanessa had known, and instead of confronting him, she had carried the weight of that betrayal. And now, was her affair with Liam retaliation? Or was it something more? Edward's gaze shifted to his desk, where Callahan's report still lay. The line about Vanessa mentioning ending this soon lingered in his thoughts. What exactly was she planning to end? Their marriage? The affair? Or was there something larger at play? Something he hadn't yet uncovered? In the quiet of the room, Edward's phone buzzed, breaking his reverie. It was a text from Callahan. "Need to meet. I found something else. This changes things." Edward's pulse quickened as he read the message. He typed back, "Come to the penthouse tomorrow." As he hit send, a sense of dread settled over him. What else could there be? Had Vanessa hidden more than just her affair? Before heading to bed, Edward placed the journal back in the drawer, closing it carefully. It wasn't just Vanessa's actions he needed to confront. It was his own. His choices had shaped their marriage, and now they were unraveling everything he thought he'd built. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Vanessa stirred beside him, her breaths steady and calm. Edward wondered if she was truly asleep, or like him, haunted by the weight of their fractured past. The air in the penthouse was heavy, oppressive. Edward paced the living room, his mind spinning with fragments of conversations, journal entries, and Callahan's reports. Vanessa was out again, her absence a glaring reminder of the growing chasm between them. The weight of everything, her affair, his own guilt, the secrets they both carried, pressed down on him like a vice. The sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. Vanessa walked in, her expression neutral, her movements deliberate. She placed her bag on the hook, pausing when she noticed Edward standing in the middle of the room, his posture tense. "Edward," she said cautiously, "you're still up?" "I couldn't sleep," he replied, his tone clipped. He gestured to the dining table where he had laid out Callahan's latest report, alongside the journal he had found. Vanessa's eyes flicked to the items, her face betraying a flicker of annoyance. "Are we doing this again?" she asked, crossing her arms. Edward stepped closer, his voice low but charged. "I read it, Vanessa. All of it. The journal, the reports, everything. I know about Liam. And I know you've been hiding something else. Something bigger." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "You had no right to go through my things." "No right?" Edward's voice rose, his control slipping. "You've been lying to me for years. You've betrayed me, humiliated me. And now you expect me to just sit here while you pretend everything is fine?" "I never pretended, Edward," Vanessa shot back, her voice sharp. "I've been honest about how I feel. You're the one who refuses to see the truth." "Then tell me the truth," Edward roared, slamming his hand on the table. "What are you hiding? What is all of this about?" Vanessa hesitated, her composure cracking for the first time. "You wouldn't understand," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "Try me," Edward demanded, his eyes burning with desperation. Vanessa sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's not just about Liam. It hasn't been for a long time. I've been trying to protect you, Edward. From yourself, from the decisions you've made. Do you think your mistakes just disappear? They don't. They haunt people. They haunt me." Edward froze, her words sinking in. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa looked at him, her gaze steady. "Do you remember Lisa, your assistant? The one you used and discarded like she meant nothing? Her life didn't just stop after you moved on, Edward. And now someone else knows about it, someone who's been holding it over my head." The revelation hit Edward like a freight train. Lisa. He had pushed her out of his mind for years, a memory he had buried under layers of denial. But now her name resurfaced, dragging with it a tidal wave of guilt and shame. "Who?" Edward asked, his voice cracking. "Who's doing this?" Vanessa shook her head. "It doesn't matter. I've been trying to keep them away from you, from us. But it's not enough anymore. They want more." Edward stared at her, his emotions boiling over. "You should have told me," he said, his voice trembling with anger and betrayal. "We could have handled this together." "Together?" Vanessa laughed bitterly. "There hasn't been a together in this marriage for years, Edward. We've been living separate lives, pretending for the sake of appearances. Don't act like this is suddenly about us." The room fell silent, the tension between them crackling like electricity. Edward's fists clenched at his sides, his vision blurring with a mix of fury and despair. "This ends tonight," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "No more lies, no more games. I'll deal with whoever is behind this." Vanessa stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "And what about us?" she asked. "What's left to deal with here, Edward?" Before he could answer, she turned and walked toward their bedroom, leaving him alone in the suffocating silence. Edward stood motionless, his thoughts racing. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. It was about everything, their past, their choices, and the destruction they had both brought upon themselves. The room felt eerily still. Edward stood motionless, his breath shallow, as the weight of what had just happened sank in. Vanessa lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath her head. His chest heaved as he gripped the paperweight still in his trembling hand. For a moment the world seemed to stop, the silence deafening. Then reality crashed back in like a tidal wave. "No, no, no, no," Edward muttered under his breath, dropping the paperweight. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed through the penthouse, sharp and jarring. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. What had he done? He hadn't meant to. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as Edward forced himself to think. He couldn't call anyone, couldn't let anyone see this. His eyes darted around the room, searching for answers, solutions, anything. His gaze landed on the large windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city was alive, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in the Martin penthouse. Edward's mind snapped into survival mode. He had to clean this up. He grabbed a towel from the kitchen, crouching down to wipe the blood from the floor. His hands moved frantically, smearing more than cleaning, but he couldn't stop. The sight of Vanessa's lifeless eyes staring into nothingness made his stomach churn. He averted his gaze, focusing instead on the mess he was trying and failing to erase. As he worked, Edward's thoughts spiraled. What will they say? What will they think? He pictured the headlines. Millionaire CEO Edward Martin accused of wife's murder. His reputation, his legacy, everything he had built, it would all crumble. He couldn't let that happen. His phone buzzed on the counter, jolting him. Callahan's name lit up the screen. Edward froze, unsure whether to answer. The timing was too coincidental. Did Callahan know? Could he somehow sense what had just happened? Edward silenced the phone, shoving it aside. After what felt like hours, Edward stood, his muscles aching from the tension. The room still bore traces of the chaos, but it was cleaner than before. He couldn't stop there. He had to make it look believable. His eyes landed on Vanessa's jewelry box, still sitting on the dresser in their bedroom. An idea formed, dark and desperate. He grabbed a handful of her valuables, scattering them across the floor. Drawers were yanked open, contents spilled in disarray. As he worked, Edward felt a strange detachment settle over him. Each action became mechanical, a means to an end. He smashed a vase, tossing the shards carelessly. He overturned a chair, its legs scraping against the pristine hardwood. The penthouse now looked less like a home and more like a crime scene, a robbery gone wrong. Edward wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, smearing blood across his temple. He didn't notice. His mind was already moving to the next step. The weapon, the paperweight, it couldn't stay here. He wrapped it in a towel, tucking it into a plastic bag from the kitchen. He stared at the clock. Barely an hour had passed since the argument began, yet it felt like a lifetime. His heart pounded as he carried the bag to the elevator. The parking garage was empty at this hour, the silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. Edward climbed into his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His knuckles turned white as he drove, every red light a potential undoing. He stopped at the river, stepping out into the cold night air. The city stretched out behind him, its lights glittering like stars. Without hesitation, Edward hurled the bag into the water. It sank quickly, disappearing beneath the surface. He stood there for a moment, watching the ripples fade. Then he turned and walked back to his car, his face a mask of resolve. When he returned to the penthouse, the sight of Vanessa's body brought the weight of his actions crashing back. He sank to his knees, his head in his hands. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry, not for Vanessa, but for the man he used to be. The morning sun filtered through the penthouse windows, its light cold and indifferent to the chaos that had unfolded hours earlier. Edward sat on the couch, his head in his hands, listening to the distant sound of sirens growing louder. He had called the police, his voice deliberately calm, reporting a break-in that had ended in tragedy. When the officers arrived, the scene was meticulously staged, just as Edward had planned. Detective Maria Ortiz stepped into the room, her sharp eyes immediately scanning every detail. She was methodical, her movements purposeful as she took in the overturned furniture, the scattered jewelry, and the shattered vase. "You're Mr. Martin?" she asked, her tone professional but probing. Edward stood, his expression appropriately shaken. "Yes," he replied, his voice hoarse. I came home late last night and found her like this. It's a nightmare." Ortiz studied him for a moment, her gaze lingering just long enough to make Edward shift uncomfortably. "We'll need a full statement," she said, gesturing to an officer. "But first, we're going to secure the scene." As the crime scene team began their work, Edward watched, his stomach twisting with every question Ortiz asked. "Do you know if anything is missing?" she queried, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Her jewelry," Edward replied quickly. "She kept it in the bedroom. It looks like they took most of it." Ortiz nodded but didn't seem convinced. She moved to the body, crouching down to examine Vanessa's lifeless form. Her gloved hands hovered over the bloodstains, tracing the patterns with a practiced eye. "This doesn't look right," she muttered to herself before glancing back at Edward. "You said you found her like this?" Edward nodded, his hands clenched at his sides. "Yes." Ortiz stood, her brow furrowed. "We'll need to take you down to the station for further questioning." The ride to the precinct felt endless. Edward rehearsed his story in his mind, smoothing out any inconsistencies. He knew the stakes were high. At the station, Ortiz led him to an interrogation room, her demeanor calm but unyielding. "Mr. Martin," she began, placing a recorder on the table, "why don't you walk us through what happened last night?" Edward took a deep breath. "I had a late meeting. When I got home, the door was ajar. I called out for Vanessa, but there was no answer. Then I found her." Ortiz's eyes never left his face. "And you didn't hear or see anyone else?" "No." Edward replied firmly. The questions continued, each one a probe for cracks in his story. Ortiz was relentless, her intuition telling her something was amiss. Did your wife have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? Edward hesitated. Not that I know of. Vanessa was well-liked. Ortiz leaned back, her gaze steady. And your marriage? How was it? Edward's jaw tightened. Our marriage was fine. Ortiz didn't press further, but her silence was heavy with implication. She gestured to an officer, who handed her a sealed evidence bag. We found this in the bedroom, she said, placing it on the table. Inside was a blood-stained journal. Edward's heart stopped. Do you recognize this? She asked. Edward forced himself to look. It's Vanessa's. She kept a journal. Ortiz nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. We'll be reviewing it as part of the investigation. Edward felt the walls closing in around him. The journal. Had Vanessa written anything that could unravel his carefully constructed story? He could only hope that whatever secrets it held wouldn't be enough to expose him. As Ortiz stood to leave, she paused by the door. Mr. Martin, she said, her tone measured. Sometimes the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard we try to hide it. Edward didn't reply. He sat alone in the sterile room, his mind racing. The investigation had only just begun, and already the cracks in his facade were starting to show. Edward's fingers tightened around the edge of the interrogation table as he replayed Detective Ortiz's parting words. Her tone lingered in his mind, each syllable a warning. The truth has a way of coming out. The blood-stained journal she had shown him felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Back at the penthouse later that evening, Edward poured himself a stiff drink. He stood by the window, staring at the city lights, trying to piece together his next move. Every decision he had made since that fateful night felt like a chain reaction spiraling out of control. And now, Vanessa's journal was in the hands of the police. What had she written? What secrets had she kept? His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. The screen displayed an unknown number. Hesitating, Edward finally answered. Hello? There was a pause before a low, familiar voice responded. Edward Martin, long time no speak. Edward's heart skipped a beat. The voice belonged to someone he hadn't thought about in years. Richard Stokes, his former business associate. Years ago, Stokes had been ousted from their company after Edward exposed his involvement in a financial scandal. It was a ruthless move, but Edward hadn't lost sleep over it, until now. What do you want, Stokes? Edward asked, his voice cold. Stokes chuckled darkly. Oh, don't play coy. You know exactly why I'm calling. Vanessa reached out to me months ago. She thought I could help her. But she didn't realize how much dirt I already had on you. Edward's grip on the phone tightened. What are you talking about? I'm talking about leverage, Edward, Stokes replied smoothly. Lisa, your assistant, remember her? You might have buried her in your past, but she never forgot, and neither did I. Edward felt the floor shift beneath him. Lisa. Her name had surfaced again, first through Vanessa's journal and now through Stokes. The shame he thought he had left behind resurfaced like a festering wound. What do you want? Edward demanded, his voice a low growl. Stokes didn't miss a beat. Simple. I want what you owe me. You destroyed my career, my life. It's only fair I return the favor, but don't worry. I'm willing to keep things quiet. For a price. How much? Edward asked, his words clipped. Oh, it's not just money, Stokes said, his tone dripping with satisfaction. I want your shares in the company, and I want them now. Edward's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a threat. It was an ultimatum that could destroy everything he had built. You think I'll just hand over my company to you? Stokes's laugh was icy. You don't have a choice, Edward. The police are circling, and I've got enough evidence to make sure they look directly at you. Vanessa may have been the one to contact me, but you're the real prize. Think about it, and don't take too long. The line went dead, leaving Edward staring at his reflection in the window. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. Stokes had always been a snake, but now he had the upper hand. And Vanessa? What had she been planning? Was she trying to protect Edward, or had she been setting him up all along? The next morning, Detective Ortiz arrived unannounced at the penthouse. "We found something else," she said, her expression unreadable. She handed Edward a small plastic bag. Inside was a torn photograph of him and Lisa, taken years ago. Edward felt the walls closing in. Every piece of the puzzle seemed designed to expose him, to dismantle his carefully curated life. Ortiz studied his reaction closely. "Do you have anything you'd like to tell us, Mr. Martin?" Edward forced a calm expression, but his mind raced. Stokes's voice echoed in his thoughts. "You don't have a choice." He wasn't just fighting to protect his legacy anymore. He was fighting for survival. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Edward sat at the defense table, his usually composed demeanor strained under the weight of the proceedings. Across the room, Detective Ortiz and the prosecution team presented their case with unyielding precision. The evidence was damning, and the truth was closing in on him. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor began, holding up a photograph of Vanessa's bloodied journal. This journal contains a detailed account of the late Vanessa Martin's fears, struggles, and plans. She documented years of emotional neglect and betrayal, as well as her discovery of Edward Martin's past infidelity. But more importantly, it reveals that she was being blackmailed, and she suspected her own husband might be involved. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his attorney leaning in to whisper something, but he barely registered it. His eyes were fixed on the journal, a damning artifact he couldn't escape. The prosecution continued, unveiling more evidence. Surveillance footage of Edward driving to the river the night of Vanessa's death. The torn photograph of Edward and Lisa recovered from Vanessa's belongings. And most damning of all, a message from Richard Stokes, implicating Edward in an attempt to cover up not just the murder, but years of corporate wrongdoing. Edward's attorney stood to counter. "My client is a man of great accomplishments," he said, his voice steady but not entirely convincing. "Yes, his marriage was strained, but that doesn't make him a murderer. The evidence against him is circumstantial. The journal? Pure speculation. The photograph? A coincidence. And Richard Stokes? A known liar with a vendetta against my client." But even as the attorney spoke, Edward could see the jury's expressions. Doubt lingered in their eyes, not about his guilt, but about how much of the truth they were hearing. He felt the walls closing in. The prosecution called its final witness, Liam Carter. Edward clenched his fists as the man he had grown to despise took the stand. Liam recounted his affair with Vanessa, painting himself as a reluctant participant who had fallen for a woman trapped in a loveless marriage. But when asked about the blackmail, Liam revealed something Edward hadn't anticipated. "Vanessa told me she was trying to protect Edward," Liam said, his voice steady. "She thought if she kept Stokes at bay, Edward wouldn't lose everything he'd worked for. She loved him, even after everything." Edward's heart sank. Vanessa's actions hadn't been about revenge. They had been about protecting him, protecting the man she once believed in, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. The realization was a knife to the gut. When it was Edward's turn to testify, he stood slowly, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He spoke of his career, his marriage, and his regrets. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Big ones. I wasn't the husband Vanessa deserved. But I didn't kill her. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was clear. "We find the defendant, Edward Martin, guilty of second-degree murder." The words rang in Edward's ears as the room erupted in murmurs and flashes from reporters' cameras. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but Edward felt nothing. He was led away in handcuffs, his once pristine image shattered beyond repair. As he sat in his cell that night, the echoes of the trial still fresh in his mind, Edward opened a letter Vanessa had written but never sent. It had been found among her belongings, a poignant reminder of what might have been. "Edward, I tried to fight for us, even when it felt impossible. I wanted to believe we could go back to what we once were. But the truth is, we've both been living in the shadows, yours and mine. Maybe one day you'll see the whole picture. Maybe then you'll understand why I did what I did." The letter ended without a signature. Edward folded it carefully, his hands shaking. For the first time, he saw Vanessa not as the woman who betrayed him, but as the one who had tried to save him, even when he didn't deserve it. What do you think of Edward Martin and his actions? Do you believe justice was served? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating true crime stories.